My wife's secret affair with her childhood friend exposed for the world to see. Let me get right into it. My wife and I met when we were both in our senior year in college. We started talking based on an interest in the same TV shows and anime, and then we eventually fell in love. To be honest, it felt so right at the time, and I didn't have too many moments when I ever doubted our relationship. There were quite a few stupid fights early on, especially regarding guys she was hanging out with, but I was always reassured. Looking back, I was probably gaslighted, or is it gaslit? But things always ended up resolved. Probably not the only red flag I ignored. Anyway, we dated for 4 years, tied the knot, and had been married for 3 years on top of that, so we're heading into our 30s. Since we met in college, we lived our childhoods very far apart. I grew up in the United States, but I found out that, before she lived here, her family lived in Ecuador, at least until she was about 12. Once she got here, she grew up in Washington. She would occasionally tell me about her childhood in Ecuador, and for someone like me, who has never left the country, these stories were pretty interesting. It was through these stories that I learned about a really close childhood friend of hers called Daniel. From the sound of things, he had one of those innocent juvenile crushes on her, though she claims she couldn't remember whether she felt the same way about him back then. She leaned towards there being very little emotion of that sort. She and Daniel hadn't been in contact much, though he had sent her a friend request on Facebook 2 or 3 years ago. They did a bit of catching up following the friend request, but soon after, it was nothing more than occasionally reacting to each other's posts on the platform, as far as I know at least. Now, the mess really started when she got a message from Daniel saying that he'd be moving to the United States. He had graduated school, worked a bit in Ecuador, and now he was ready to jump into the US job market. Great for him. The problem was, my wife seemed to be the only person that this guy really knew in the US, and he really wanted them to meet up so they could reconnect and he could also learn the basics of living in this country. That was new to him. To be honest, I didn't really think there was much wrong with this. They last saw each other when they were kids. There was little interaction as adults, none of it in person, and both she and Daniel seemed to be happily married. His wife would be coming along with him after all. So, the time finally came around, and Daniel flew over to the United States. He was going to start work in California, but his flight plan was to come straight to Dulles and go by road to Cali. My wife offered to pay for his road trip so it'd be less inconvenient for him. In fact, she didn't consult me before she agreed to pay for him, but he chose to make the trip to see her, so I'd have preferred if he took the brunt financially. But at the time I thought, I might have been a jerk, considering this was a guy from South America about to start a new life. So maybe it was a huge help for all the financial weight not to be on him. I drove my wife to meet him at a public park and noticed that there was no one else with Daniel. I knew he travelled with his wife, so I expected to see her there. After the pleasantries, I asked about his wife, and he said she went straight to Cali. I felt a little twinge of unease at that, since I had kind of removed any worry from my mind based on the fact that his wife would be around. But it wasn't surprising that she wouldn't want to spend the entire day in Washington, so I let it go. Since they were likely going to spend the whole day reminiscing in Spanish, and I really didn't want to be a third wheel, I took off. They'd have the day to themselves. She'd show him the sights of Washington, and I'd come pick them up whenever they were ready to call their day to a close. Again, this was a childhood friend that she hadn't seen in years. So, as much as I was a bit jealous that she was spending the whole day with another man, I wasn't too worried about any risk. It didn't seem likely that anything could happen between them so suddenly and without arrangement. It was several hours later when I got a message from my wife saying that it would be fine if I picked her up at any time from then. She sent me the address, and it was the bar we frequented the most, Again, I felt a little jealous. But it's a great bar to drink at and converse, so it made sense. As long as no one had too much to drink, things would be fine. About 15 minutes after she sent the message, I left the house and made my way to the bar she was at. I got there and saw her and Daniel sitting at the usual spot, laughing intensely. I walked up to them, and while my wife smiled on seeing me, the laughter kind of faded out. The two of them didn't seem to be very eager to leave, but I guess my presence was like a bad omen, bringing their great night to a close. My wife said bye to Daniel and hugged him. I shook his hand, and we all left the bar together. My wife ordered an Uber to take him home, and we drove back to our house. So, how was your day with Daniel? That was the first thing out of my mouth as I took off my coat after entering the house. She seemed very happy to recount everything that happened, and again, I felt jealous. But wouldn't you say it made sense to be happy about reconnecting with someone you hadn't seen for a very long time? I chalked it up to my insecurity and listened to her as she went on about how they walked through the park and chatted, how she took him into a museum, how they got a quick bite to eat, and how they ended up at the bar. I had an odd feeling towards the end of her story though, because she had a lot of details to share about what they talked about and all the other places, but they didn't seem to talk about much beyond the sports game that was on at the bar, at least according to how she recounted the story. I didn't pry though, because I hate seeming overly suspicious and insecure, and I really had nothing solid to be wary of. The rest of the night went fine though, and I got over the niggly feeling I had. The next morning, literally seconds before I walked out of the house for work, my wife quickly squeezed in that she might be going to see Daniel. Yeah, at that point, I had a lot more than a niggly feeling. We had a conversation that went something like this. What? Isn't he supposed to be heading to California today? Do you want to see him before he heads to the bus station or what? He'll push his departure back by a day. Just a day? He'll go tomorrow? Yes, but there's so much to talk about and I don't know the next time I'll see him. When did you find out he was staying an extra day? We talked about it yesterday at the bar, but nothing was confirmed yet. He let me know he'd made up his mind this morning. I just stood there, dumbfounded, with a sinking feeling in my gut. Something just seemed wrong. Daniel wasn't a bad-looking guy. I'd say I look better, though, if I do say so myself. So I started to wonder whether she felt some kind of spark for him that wasn't there when they were kids. I must have stood there without saying anything for quite some time because she said, "Babe," to catch my attention. In response to that, all I said was, "Okay." I had to get to work, so I turned to leave right then. She must have felt something was wrong because as I stepped through the doorway, she said, "I have to show up at work, so I won't spend much time with him, baby." I didn't bother replying. Now, let's fast forward to when I was at work. Honestly, I was having a pretty hard time concentrating because I had a very unpleasant feeling about my wife and Daniel. To be honest, I struggle with insecurity sometimes, so I had to keep asking myself whether I was overthinking things. I tried to keep my mind under control, but I failed and decided to ask to leave work early. My boss loves me, so that wasn't hard, especially since it was such an unusual request for me. I was granted permission, and off I went. I started to feel very crazy at this point, especially because I did something I'm not super proud to recount, but it was worth it. I've always been good at thinking things through, so the first thing I did was to park my car at a shopping mall. After that, I took an Uber to a Hertz place and rented a very basic vehicle. I drove it to the hotel my wife mentioned Daniel was staying at, and I found a place to park that gave me a good view of the hotel's entrance. In case you're confused, I obviously couldn't drive my own car because my wife might have recognized it. Again, I felt crazy and stupid during all of this because I wasn't even sure she was at the hotel. If she was to be believed, They would have taken another day out on the town, and I had no clue where to start searching if they left the hotel. After about an hour of sitting there, they emerged together from the hotel's front entrance, and I couldn't help but get a bit riled up again because she clearly didn't go to work. I started following them as they walked to a restaurant and went inside. I parked as close to the restaurant as I could, and I went in to get a table of my own. The place was packed, so it wasn't that weird that I'd be seated at the bar area. I wasn't close enough to hear every single word they were saying, but I heard enough to make my stomach turn. They talked about old times, which is fine. Then they talked about their lives after they moved apart, which is also fine. What started to become a problem was when Daniel started to talk about how beautiful he thought my wife was back then, and how she grew up to be even more beautiful than he ever could have imagined. He was clearly laying it on thick, and to my absolute dismay, my wife wasn't cutting the conversation short. She had this almost unsure expression on her face and was taking in everything he said. Now, what happened next is what made me lose control. Daniel started to talk about how he knew he'd never have a chance with her and that he admired my wife for not only being so gorgeous, but also being so successful. He followed that up by saying that he'd always be there for her and that his crush on her never died. I wasn't close enough to hear my wife's response. All I knew was that Daniel had said way too much for me to sit quietly any longer. I walked over to them and demanded that my wife leave with me immediately. It caught her by surprise, and she didn't hesitate. As we walked out, I gave Daniel a piece of my mind and made it clear that I didn't appreciate him overstepping his boundaries. My wife looked embarrassed and tried to apologize to Daniel, but I was having none of it. I told her to get in the car and drove us back home in silence. At home, I couldn't hold back any longer. I confronted her about everything. She swore that nothing had happened between them and that she had no intention of doing anything inappropriate. She claimed that she was just caught off guard by Daniel's words and didn't know how to react. She promised that she wouldn't see him again and that she had already told him that nothing could happen between them. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I hadn't intervened, something might have happened. The whole situation left me feeling uneasy and questioning the trust I had in our relationship. While I still love my wife, this experience has made me more cautious and aware of potential red flags. Only time will tell if our relationship can fully recover from this ordeal. My reaction for OP. As the song goes, if you love someone, set them free. You can't force a relationship. Could it be that it's better for each person to set their own boundaries and to come to their own realization? Now, on to the update. Update. Hey everyone, I'm glad to say that the update you've all been waiting for is here. And I'm just as happy to be telling you all about it as you will probably be to read it. The first step was the divorce. I called a college friend who's now a successful divorce lawyer. Papers were filed, she's been served, and while we haven't finalised everything, we don't have kids or a house, so alimony shouldn't be an issue. I'm fine with letting her keep the apartment because the rent was high and she loved the view, which didn't matter to me. She called me crying, asking if she could come over to talk. I told her she could say whatever she needed to over the phone. She went on about feeling alone and making a mistake, but looking back at her actions brought me back to my senses quickly. I found Daniel's name online and traced his wife easily. I shared everything I knew about his affair during their trip to America, including a video that confirmed his betrayal. She was understandably upset, but it was comforting to connect with someone who was in a similar situation. We've talked a lot since, and while I'm not planning anything, it would be poetic justice if something developed between us. She's planning to leave him, which is exactly what I wanted. I just hope she doesn't reconsider since she came to America dependent on him. Dealing with my wife required a different approach. I informed her close family and friends about the situation, including her sister, who still didn't know what had happened. I didn't share the video with them, but was prepared to if anyone doubted me. I couldn't make her lose her job, but I aimed to make her workplace uncomfortable. I had a contact in her building who could spread the word discreetly. I asked him to subtly mention my separation to someone on her floor to stir up the gossip. I promised him lunch as a thank you. The satisfaction I felt when my wife called me, furious about the news spreading at her job, was immense. I told her I had no idea how it happened, as I didn't know anyone at her office. She insisted I must have told someone, and hearing her frustration was a strange pleasure. She also complained about me informing her loved ones, but I just told her to be thankful I hadn't sent them the video too. She vowed to make the divorce process difficult, but I'm ready for it. I should have waited until things were finalized before exacting my revenge, but I was too eager to get back at her. Either way, I'm relieved to be free from her. I'd rather be single than stay with someone unfaithful. If this is how things turned out, I'll accept it and look forward to better things ahead. Thank you all for listening. I hope my story offers some insight. It wasn't easy to go through, but I'm young and determined not to waste my time on someone like her again.